The saddest mistake a king can make is believing that the quietest person in the room matters the least. The Grand Moon Gala glittered beneath a ceiling of crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting across polished marble floors and silver-trimmed banners that hung from the vaulted walls of Blackthorne Palace. Every noble family in the Northern Territories had gathered for the most anticipated night of the year. Laughter drifted through the air. Expensive gowns shimmered. Young women stood a little straighter whenever the palace doors opened, hoping for a glimpse of the man everyone had come to see. Alpha King Rowan Blackthorne. At 29, Rowan ruled more territory than any alpha before him. Stories followed him everywhere. Some called him brilliant. Others called him ruthless. Most agreed on one thing. Nobody dared challenge him. Near the edge of the enormous ballroom, Evelyn Carter adjusted her grip on a silver serving tray. She moved carefully between clusters of guests, balancing crystal glasses while doing her best to remain invisible. That part was easy. Most people had spent her entire life overlooking her. She wasn't a noble. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't the daughter of anyone important. She was simply one of the palace attendants hired to work the gala. And tonight, like every other night, she blended into the background. A group of noble women passed by without acknowledging her existence. One brushed against her shoulder and kept walking. Not a glance. Not an apology. Evelyn lowered her eyes and continued forward. She was used to it. Still, somewhere deep inside, a small part of her wondered what it felt like to walk into a room and be seen. Music swelled from the orchestra balcony. Conversations quieted. Then the massive doors at the far end of the hall opened. Every head turned. Every voice stopped. Alpha King Rowan Blackthorne entered the ballroom. The effect was immediate. The atmosphere itself seemed to shift around him. Tall and composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored black formal coat, Rowan moved through the crowd with effortless confidence. Nobles bowed their heads. Advisors stepped aside. Even the loudest guests suddenly remembered their manners. Evelyn glanced up for only a moment before looking away. She had learned long ago that people like him existed in a different world, a world far above hers. But as Rowan crossed the ballroom, his silver eyes swept across the crowd. He examined every noble family, every potential alliance, every ambitious smile. Everyone wanted something from him. Everyone expected something from him. The weight of leadership sat on his shoulders like an invisible crown. For a brief second, his gaze passed over Evelyn. Then it moved on. She was just another servant carrying drinks. Just another face among hundreds. Forgotten before he had even truly seen her. Evelyn continued working, unaware that fate had already begun moving pieces into place. Outside, beyond the palace walls, clouds drifted across the moonlit sky. Inside, the music continued. The nobles laughed. The king observed. And the girl everyone ignored carried her tray through the crowd, never imagining that before this story was over, the most powerful man in the kingdom would wish he had paid attention when he had the chance. The orchestra shifted into a slower melody as servants moved through the ballroom, carrying fresh trays of sparkling drinks and delicate desserts. Evelyn balanced another silver tray against her palm and followed the practiced route she had memorized during years of palace work. Keep moving. Keep smiling. Do not draw attention. The rules had become second nature. Across the hall, clusters of nobles surrounded Alpha King Rowan Blackthorne like planets orbiting a star. Advisors sought his approval. Merchants competed for his attention. Young women laughed a little too loudly whenever he glanced in their direction. Rowan endured it all with the calm expression of a man accustomed to being watched. Yet beneath that composed exterior, fatigue lingered. Every conversation felt identical. Every compliment carried an agenda. Every introduction came wrapped in expectation. He listened politely while a wealthy lord described trade opportunities near the western border, but his attention drifted. Then movement near the refreshment table caught his eye. A servant nearly collided with another attendant while carrying a tray stacked with crystal glasses. The young man froze, panic flashing across his face. Before disaster could unfold, Evelyn stepped forward. She steadied the tray with one hand and quietly helped him regain balance. The moment passed so quickly that almost nobody noticed. The young servant mouthed a grateful thank you. Evelyn simply smiled and continued walking. Rowan observed the exchange for half a second before returning to his conversation. Strange. Most people in the palace were too busy protecting themselves to help anyone else. Still, the thought disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. The evening continued. More guests arrived. More music filled the air. Eventually, the royal master of ceremonies announced a formal procession. Servants adjusted positions around the ballroom, while nobles crowded closer to the central staircase. Evelyn moved carefully along the outer edge of the gathering. She could feel the excitement building around her like static electricity before a storm. Everyone wanted the perfect view. Everyone wanted to be close to power. A sudden shove from behind broke her concentration. Not hard. Not enough to cause harm. Just enough. Her shoulder bumped another attendant. One crystal glass tipped sideways. A stream of sparkling cider splashed across black fabric. Silence rippled outward. Evelyn froze. The dark sleeve of Rowan Blackthorne's formal coat now carried a streak of silver droplets that glimmered beneath the chandelier light. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Heat rushed into her face. Her heartbeat stumbled. For one painful second, the enormous ballroom seemed to shrink around her. She lowered her tray immediately. "Your Majesty, I am so sorry," she said softly. Rowan looked down at the stain before raising his eyes to hers. Around them, nobles watched with open curiosity. Some appeared amused already. The Alpha King studied her for a moment. Then one corner of his mouth lifted. It was not a kind smile. "Interesting," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Most people spend years trying to get my attention. You found a much faster method." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Evelyn felt every sound land like a stone. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but stopped herself. The laughter grew. Rowan turned away, already dismissing the incident as insignificant. To him, it was nothing more than a passing joke. To Evelyn, it was something else entirely. She lowered her eyes, tightened her grip on the tray, and forced herself to keep walking while the laughter followed behind her like an echo she could not escape. The laughter did not fade when Evelyn walked away. If anything, it followed her through the ballroom like a shadow. Every time she passed another cluster of guests, she caught fragments of whispers. Some repeated the Alpha King's joke. Others exaggerated it. A few simply laughed because everyone else was laughing. Evelyn kept her back straight and her expression calm. Years of being overlooked had taught her how to survive embarrassment. Do not react. Do not give them more to enjoy. Still, her fingers tightened around the silver tray until her knuckles turned pale. Near the center staircase, Rowan accepted greetings from nobles who seemed eager to impress him. The incident with the servant girl had already slipped from his mind. There were treaties to discuss, border disputes to settle, and endless political conversations waiting for him. To Rowan, the moment had been insignificant. One careless joke, one forgotten face, nothing more. Yet throughout the ballroom, others continued feeding the story. Lady Victoria Ashford, daughter of one of the wealthiest noble families in the kingdom, covered her smile with a jeweled fan as Evelyn passed nearby. "There she is," Victoria said to her companions. The brave servant who found a way to interrupt the king himself. More laughter followed. Evelyn lowered her eyes and continued walking. Her cheeks warmed, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. Victoria watched her leave with visible amusement. Perhaps next year she will spill an entire pitcher if she wants even more attention. The women surrounding her laughed again. Not because the comment was clever, because Victoria was important. Across the room, the orchestra began another song. Couples drifted toward the dance floor. Crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of points of golden light across polished marble. The gala remained beautiful, but for Evelyn, the evening felt smaller now. Colder. She delivered another tray to a refreshment station and finally allowed herself a slow breath. She only needed to survive a few more hours. Then she could return to her small room in the servants' wing and forget this night ever happened. Or at least try to. As she turned toward the western corridor, a sudden movement caught her attention. A young boy stood alone near one of the palace columns. He could not have been older than 8. Unlike the other children attending the gala, he wore simple dark clothing rather than expensive formal attire. He stood quietly while groups of adults passed by without noticing him. Something about him felt strangely familiar. Not his face, his expression, the loneliness in it. Evelyn slowed her pace. The boy seemed uncomfortable among the crowd, watching everyone else while remaining entirely unseen. She knew exactly what that felt like. Before she could approach him, One of the palace stewards called her name from across the room. "Evelyn, we need more glasses in the East Hall." She immediately nodded and turned back toward her duties. When she glanced over her shoulder a moment later, the boy was still standing there alone. No one had approached him. No one seemed to realize he was there. And for reasons she could not explain, Evelyn found herself wondering why a child who looked so invisible seemed completely unafraid of being forgotten. The Eastern Hall was quieter than the ballroom, but the sounds of the gala still drifted through the open archways like distant waves. Evelyn carried a stack of clean crystal glasses toward a refreshment station and tried to focus on her work. It should have been easy. Normally, work helped her disappear into the rhythm of the evening. Tonight was different. Every time she remembered the laughter, a tightness settled in her chest. Not because strangers had laughed. Strangers always laughed. What bothered her was how easy it had been. One careless remark from the most powerful man in the kingdom, and suddenly hundreds of people had decided she was a joke. She placed the glasses neatly on the table and released a slow breath. "There you are." The voice startled her. Evelyn turned to find the same young boy, standing a few feet away. Up close, he looked even younger than she had thought. His dark hair was slightly messy, and his gray eyes watched the room with unusual caution. He did not seem frightened, just lonely. "Hello," Evelyn said gently. The boy offered a small nod, but did not speak. For a moment she wondered if he was shy. Then she noticed the way he hesitated whenever words seemed expected. Understanding dawned slowly. "You do not talk much, do you?" she asked softly. The boy shook his head. Evelyn smiled. "That is okay. Sometimes people say too much anyway." For the first time, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. Evelyn felt something inside her relax. She picked up a folded napkin and borrowed a pencil from the refreshment table. After a moment, she wrote a simple question. "Are you enjoying the party?" The boy looked at the words and then at the enormous hall beyond them. After a few seconds, he took the pencil and carefully wrote a single answer. "No." Evelyn laughed quietly. Not the forced laugh she had used all evening. A real one. The boy studied her expression as if surprised to hear genuine amusement. He wrote again. "Too loud. Too many people." "I understand," Evelyn said. "I feel the same way sometimes." His eyes widened slightly, as if nobody had ever admitted that before. For the next several minutes, they communicated through short notes and small gestures. The conversation was simple, but something about it felt effortless. The boy seemed more comfortable with every exchange. The tension in his shoulders slowly eased. He even smiled twice. Neither of them noticed the elderly palace attendant watching from the far end of the corridor. The old woman paused in surprise. She had worked at Blackthorne Palace for nearly 30 years. She recognized the child immediately. More importantly, she recognized how unusual this scene was. The boy rarely approached strangers. He trusted almost no one. Yet here he stood beside a servant girl, completely at ease. After a while, a distant bell echoed through the palace halls. The boy's expression changed instantly. He looked toward the ballroom entrance. Whatever comfort he had found seemed to vanish. Evelyn noticed it immediately. "Do you need to go?" she asked. The boy nodded once. Before leaving, he took the pencil one final time and wrote 3 words across the napkin. "Thank you, Evelyn." She blinked in surprise. She had never told him her name. By the time she looked up to ask how he knew it, the boy was already disappearing into the crowd, leaving her alone with a strange feeling that their brief conversation had mattered far more than either of them realized. The rest of the gala passed in a blur. Evelyn completed every task assigned to her, smiled when expected, and avoided looking toward the center of the ballroom, where the kingdom's most powerful guests continued celebrating beneath the chandeliers. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the boy. There had been something unusual about him. Not his clothes, not his appearance, the sadness in his eyes, the way he seemed accustomed to standing alone while surrounded by people. Long after midnight, the final guests began departing. Carriages rolled away from the palace entrance one by one. Musicians packed their instruments. Servants extinguished rows of candles until only a warm glow remained throughout the vast halls. Exhaustion settled into Evelyn's bones. She carried the last tray into the palace kitchen and carefully placed it on a wooden counter. Around her, other attendants exchanged tired conversation as they finished their duties. A few still joked about the incident with the Alpha King. Evelyn pretended not to hear them. She collected her belongings and slipped quietly through a side corridor leading toward the servants' wing. The palace felt completely different at night. Without the crowds, the enormous hallways seemed almost peaceful. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, casting silver patterns across the marble floor. For the first time all evening, she could finally breathe. As she reached a small courtyard between two palace wings, she stopped. Cool night air brushed against her face. Somewhere beyond the walls, crickets sang beneath the summer sky. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment and let the silence wash over her. Then she heard footsteps. Small footsteps. She turned. The boy from earlier stood near a stone fountain at the center of the courtyard. He appeared just as surprised to see her. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Evelyn smiled. "You should be asleep." The boy smiled back. He approached the fountain and sat carefully on its edge. Moonlight reflected across the water beside him. Evelyn joined him a few feet away. Neither spoke. Strangely, the silence felt comfortable. After a minute, the boy pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote something. He held it toward her. "Are you sad?" The question caught her off guard. She looked down at the page. For a moment, she considered lying. Instead, she offered a small shrug. "A little." The boy watched her carefully. "Why?" Evelyn stared at the fountain water. Countless answers came to mind. The laughter, the embarrassment, the feeling of being invisible. But none of those felt important enough anymore. "Because sometimes people decide who you are before they ever get to know you," she said softly. The boy read her words through her expression rather than her voice. Slowly, he nodded, as though he understood perfectly. Then he wrote something else. "Me too." Evelyn felt her heart tighten. Before she could respond, distant voices echoed from somewhere inside the palace. Several adults seemed to be searching for someone. The boy immediately stood. Concern flashed across his face. He slipped the notebook back into his pocket. "They are looking for you," Evelyn asked. He nodded. Then, before leaving, he hesitated and wrote one final message on a loose piece of paper. "You are nicer than they are." Evelyn blinked in surprise. By the time she looked up again, he was already hurrying toward the palace shadows. She watched him disappear through an archway. Alone once more, she lowered her eyes to the note still resting in her hands. A strange feeling settled over her. She had spent the entire evening believing nobody truly saw her. Yet somehow, the one person who seemed completely forgotten had noticed her more clearly than anyone else. The following morning, Blackthorne Palace woke to confusion. Servants whispered in hallways. Guards moved quickly between wings of the enormous estate. Advisors gathered in clusters, speaking in low voices that stopped whenever someone approached. Evelyn noticed it immediately. She had barely begun arranging breakfast trays when she sensed the tension spreading through the staff. Something was wrong. "What happened?" she quietly asked another attendant. The woman glanced around before answering. "Nobody knows exactly. Someone important cannot be found." Evelyn frowned. Important enough to unsettle an entire palace. The answer arrived sooner than she expected. Less than an hour later, a royal steward entered the servants' hall with a pale expression. "All staff are to report anything unusual from last night," he announced. "Anything at all." Unease rippled through the room. Evelyn lowered her gaze. Her thoughts immediately returned to the boy, the notebook, the courtyard, the voices searching for him. At first she told herself it was probably unrelated. Then she heard another servant whisper a name she had never expected. "Prince Oliver." Evelyn's breath caught. Prince, the quiet child who hated crowds. The lonely boy who communicated through notes. The boy everyone seemed to overlook. Her mind raced. Before she could process the revelation, activity erupted near the palace entrance. Through a nearby window, she saw black carriages arriving one after another. Noble families, royal council members, senior advisors. The situation was clearly serious. Across the palace, Rowan Blackthorne stood inside the council chamber, listening as reports arrived from every corner of the estate. His expression remained controlled, but frustration simmered beneath the surface. "Nothing?" he asked. A captain lowered his head. "No sign of him, Your Majesty." Silence settled over the room. Oliver's disappearance made no sense. The prince rarely wandered far from trusted attendants. He disliked unfamiliar places. Crowds overwhelmed him. Yet somehow he had vanished. Without explanation, Rowan moved toward the tall windows overlooking the palace grounds. Below, dozens of people searched gardens, courtyards, and surrounding pathways. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle heavily across his shoulders. Oliver was not merely a prince. He was family. The boy's safety mattered more than treaties, politics, or royal appearances. Meanwhile, Evelyn stood frozen beside a serving cart. She remembered every detail from the previous night. The sadness in Oliver's eyes. His discomfort during the gala. The way he seemed relieved whenever they spoke. A painful realization formed slowly. Nobody had truly been looking at him. They had been looking past him, just as they often looked past her. Then another memory surfaced. The note he had written before leaving. "You are nicer than they are." Evelyn stared down at her hands. Something about those words suddenly felt important. Not because of what they said, because of why he had written them. For one evening, someone had treated him like a child instead of a title. And now the entire kingdom was searching for a prince who had spent most of the gala standing completely alone. As palace bells echoed across the estate, Evelyn felt a growing certainty she could not explain. Everyone else seemed to be searching for a missing prince. But perhaps they were asking the wrong questions. Perhaps the real mystery was why he had wanted to disappear in the first place. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside Blackthorne Palace had become almost unrecognizable. The elegant calm that usually defined the royal estate had been replaced by anxious movement and whispered conversations. Servants carried messages instead of trays. Guards checked corridors that had already been searched twice. Advisors moved from chamber to chamber with growing concern etched across their faces. Evelyn worked quietly among them, but her attention remained fixed on the same question. Where was Oliver? Throughout the day, she replayed every moment of their conversations. The notes, the shy smiles, the way he seemed relieved whenever nobody expected him to be someone important. Each memory revealed something she had missed before. Oliver had never spoken about where he belonged. He had never mentioned being a prince. He had never behaved like royalty. In fact, he had seemed almost uncomfortable whenever people were nearby. As evening approached, a new rumor spread through the palace. The prince had apparently disappeared before. Not for long, never more than a few hours, but enough to worry those responsible for protecting him. This time felt different. Hours had become nearly an entire day. In the royal council chamber, Rowan listened to another report. Nothing in the gardens. Nothing beyond the eastern grounds. Nothing from neighboring villages. The captain lowered his eyes. Rowan stood silently beside the long conference table. His exhaustion was beginning to show. The previous night's gala felt distant now. Important decisions regarding trade agreements and political alliances had completely vanished from his priorities. Only one thing mattered: finding Oliver. Across the room, an elderly advisor cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should reconsider the final hours before the disappearance." Rowan turned toward him. "Explain." People often reveal more than they realize when they feel comfortable. Perhaps someone spoke with the prince. The suggestion lingered in the room. For the first time, attention shifted away from maps and search routes. Instead, investigators began interviewing palace staff. One by one, servants were questioned about anything unusual they had witnessed during the gala. Eventually, a steward entered the kitchen where Evelyn was helping prepare supper. "Evelyn Carter?" She looked up immediately. "Yes. The council would like to speak with you." Her stomach tightened. Several nearby attendants exchanged curious glances. Evelyn followed the steward through winding corridors until they reached a smaller meeting chamber. Inside, 3 advisors sat around a table covered with reports. An elderly woman stood near the window, the same palace attendant who had watched her speaking with Oliver the night before. Recognition flashed across the woman's face. "It was her," she said quietly. Evelyn froze. One advisor leaned forward. "You spent time with Prince Oliver during the gala." It was not a question. Evelyn's heart skipped. Prince Oliver. Hearing the title spoken aloud still felt strange. "Yes," she answered carefully. "We talked." The advisors exchanged surprised looks. "Talked," one repeated. "For how long?" "Several times throughout the evening." Silence followed. Not skeptical silence. Shocked silence. The elderly attendant folded her hands. "Your Majesty," she said softly toward the doorway behind Evelyn. "I believe we have found the last person Oliver chose to trust." Evelyn turned. Standing in the entrance was Rowan Blackthorne himself. His silver eyes settled on her face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the Alpha King took a slow step into the room. And for the first time since the gala, He truly looked at the girl he had dismissed. The room remained silent after Rowan entered. Not the comfortable silence Evelyn had shared with Oliver beside the fountain. This silence carried weight, expectation, authority. Every person at the table seemed to be waiting for something. Evelyn lowered her eyes instinctively. The memory of the gala flashed through her mind. The laughter, the careless joke, the feeling of being dismissed before she had even spoken. Rowan crossed the room and stopped near the head of the table. His attention never left her face. For the first time, he noticed details he had overlooked before. The steadiness in her posture, the quiet composure she carried despite standing before the most powerful people in the kingdom. She looked nervous, certainly, but not intimidated. There was a difference. One of the advisors cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, we would like you to tell us everything you remember about your conversations with Prince Oliver." Evelyn nodded. "I did not know he was a prince." Several people exchanged glances. "That much is obvious," the elderly attendant said gently. "Oliver rarely approaches strangers, especially not during large gatherings." Evelyn hesitated. He seemed lonely. The statement surprised everyone in the room. Not because it was inaccurate, because nobody else had said it aloud. Rowan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Evelyn continued carefully. "He did not enjoy the gala. He said it was too loud, too crowded. He looked uncomfortable whenever people gathered around him." One advisor frowned. "And yet he spoke with you." Evelyn glanced down at her hands. "Not exactly. We used notes." The elderly attendant smiled sadly. "That sounds like Oliver." Rowan remained silent. Every word felt like a small revelation. Advisors discussed the prince's education. His tutors reported progress. His attendants reported stability. Yet somehow this servant girl had recognized something deeper after only a few conversations. Loneliness. Isolation. The realization unsettled him. Did he mention where he might go? Rowan finally asked. His voice was calm, but the room immediately grew still. Evelyn thought carefully. No, but he seemed happiest when nobody expected anything from him. Another silence followed, this one heavier than before, because everyone understood what she meant. Oliver lived surrounded by expectations. Royal expectations. Public expectations. Family expectations. Perhaps nobody had asked what he wanted. The elderly attendant stepped forward. "There is something else." She reached into her pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "One of the gardeners found this near the western greenhouse this morning." Rowan unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was small and familiar. Oliver's. Several lines had been crossed out before one sentence remained clearly visible. "I want to go somewhere people see me first and my title second." The room froze. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. She remembered the boy standing alone among hundreds of guests. She remembered the relief in his eyes whenever their conversations became simple, human, real. Rowan stared at the note for a long moment. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. A servant girl holding a tray. A joke. Laughter. Dismissal. He slowly lowered the paper. For the first time, a troubling thought entered his mind. If he had been wrong about Evelyn so quickly and so completely, what else had he failed to see standing right in front of him all this time? The note remained on the table long after the conversation ended. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. The words written in Oliver's careful handwriting had exposed something uncomfortable. Not about the prince. About everyone around him. Eventually, the advisors returned to discussing search routes and possible destinations. But the urgency in the room had changed. They were no longer searching only for where Oliver had gone. They were beginning to understand why. Evelyn stood quietly near the doorway, convinced her role in the matter was finished. She had answered their questions. She had shared everything she knew. Now she expected to return to the servants' hall and disappear back into the background where she belonged. "Miss Carter." Rowan's voice stopped her before she could leave. Every person in the room looked up. Evelyn turned slowly. "Yes, Your Majesty." Rowan studied her for a moment. The same girl he had barely noticed at the gala now stood at the center of the most important discussion in the kingdom. The irony was impossible to ignore. "If Oliver trusted you," Rowan said carefully, "then you may notice things others would overlook." One advisor frowned. "Your Majesty, surely palace staff should not participate in an official search." Rowan did not take his eyes off Evelyn. "Official searches have produced nothing." Silence followed. Nobody challenged him again. Evelyn felt completely unprepared for the attention suddenly directed toward her. "I do not know where he is," she said honestly. "I know." Rowan nodded. "But if you were him, where would you go?" The question lingered in the air. Evelyn looked down at the note on the table. "I want to go somewhere people see me first and my title second." She thought about the crowded ballroom, the endless expectations, the lonely child standing unnoticed beside a column. Then another memory surfaced. Oliver's face when they sat beside the fountain, the calm in his eyes, the relief. "Somewhere quiet," she said softly. "Somewhere nobody expects him to be important." Several advisors exchanged skeptical looks. "That could be anywhere," one muttered. Evelyn shook her head. "No," everyone looked at her. "Not anywhere. Somewhere ordinary." She gathered her thoughts. He liked places where nobody was watching, places where conversations felt real, not formal, not planned. The elderly attendant near the window suddenly straightened. "The Western Greenhouse." Rowan turned toward her immediately. "Explain." "When Oliver was younger, he spent hours there." A faint smile touched her face. "Most people forgot it existed. He loved that." Hope flickered across several expressions. It was the first meaningful lead all day. Within minutes, messengers were dispatched toward the old greenhouse grounds. Advisors hurried from the chamber. The room emptied quickly until only Rowan and Evelyn remained. For a moment, neither spoke. The palace suddenly felt very quiet. Rowan glanced toward her. "You helped us today." Evelyn offered a small smile. "I only listened." The words landed harder than she intended, because deep down, both of them understood the truth hidden inside that simple statement. She had not solved the mystery through power, or influence, or authority. She had solved it because she had listened when nobody else had. Rowan looked away first, and for the second time that day, he found himself wondering how many mistakes begin with failing to see the person standing directly in front of you. The Western Greenhouse stood near the edge of the royal grounds, tucked behind rows of ancient cedar trees that shielded it from the rest of the estate. Years ago, it had been one of the palace's most beautiful places. Now it was mostly forgotten. Vines climbed the glass walls. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the stone pathways. Few people visited anymore, which was exactly why Oliver had loved it. As twilight settled across the kingdom, Rowan crossed the grounds with several advisors and a small group of attendants. Their pace quickened the closer they came. Nobody spoke. Hope had become too precious to risk with careless words. Behind them, Evelyn followed quietly at the elderly attendant's invitation. She still felt out of place among nobles and royal officials, but nobody questioned her presence anymore. Not after the note. Not after the lead. When they finally reached the greenhouse, the doors stood slightly open. A soft breeze drifted. Through the gap, every person froze. Rowan's heartbeat quickened. Then he stepped forward and pushed the door open completely. Warm evening light spilled across rows of plants and flower beds. The scent of earth and blooming jasmine filled the air. For a brief moment, nobody saw anything. Then a small voice laughed. Heads turned immediately. Near the far end of the greenhouse, Oliver sat cross-legged beside an elderly gardener. Between them rested several clay pots filled with seedlings. The prince was smiling. Actually smiling. Not the polite expression expected during ceremonies. Not the guarded smile people celebrated whenever he appeared in public. This smile was real. The gardener looked up first. His eyes widened in alarm. Oliver followed his gaze. The smile faded instantly. Silence swept through the greenhouse. Rowan stared at him. Relief arrived so suddenly it almost hurt. Oliver was safe. Safe and happy. The realization carried equal parts comfort and guilt. The advisors rushed forward with questions. Palace staff called his name. Concerned voices filled the room. Oliver shrank back slightly beneath the attention. Evelyn noticed it immediately. She noticed the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes lowered toward the floor. The same thing had happened at the gala. Too many people. Too many expectations. Rowan noticed it too. Slowly, he raised a hand. The greenhouse fell quiet. The sudden silence seemed to surprise everyone, including Oliver. For a long moment, Rowan simply looked at the boy. Then he crossed the room alone. No speeches. No lectures. No questions. He stopped beside Oliver and sat on the wooden bench nearby. "We were worried," he said softly. Oliver looked down. The gardener quietly stepped away, leaving them space. Several seconds passed before Oliver pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He wrote carefully and handed it over. Rowan read the words. Here, nobody cared who I was. The sentence struck harder than any accusation. Rowan folded the paper slowly. Around them, nobody spoke, because there was nothing to argue with. The truth sat plainly on the page. For years, the kingdom had protected Oliver, educated him, guided him, prepared him. Yet somehow a servant girl and an old gardener had made him feel more understood than an entire palace full of people. Rowan glanced across the greenhouse. His eyes found Evelyn standing quietly near the entrance. For the third time in 2 days, he saw something he should have recognized much sooner. Some people change a room simply by making others feel seen. And he had laughed at one of them. The palace returned to normal on the surface, but something had changed beneath it. Servants resumed their duties. Advisors returned to meetings. Noble guests departed with stories about the gala and the prince's safe return. Yet for Rowan Blackthorne, normal no longer felt quite the same. Over the following days, he found himself noticing things he had overlooked for years. The people who worked quietly behind the scenes. The attendants who kept the palace running. The individuals whose names rarely appeared in reports or ceremonies. And among them, one name returned to his thoughts far more often than he cared to admit. Evelyn Carter. One afternoon, Rowan stood in the library reviewing documents when Oliver entered carrying a notebook beneath his arm. The boy appeared more relaxed than he had in months. He paused beside the desk and wrote something before sliding the notebook forward. Have you thanked her? Rowan stared at the question. For a moment, he almost smiled. Trust Oliver to ask the one question he had been avoiding. Not properly, Rowan admitted. Oliver raised an eyebrow. Rowan leaned back in his chair. I am aware that I handled our first meeting poorly. Oliver quickly wrote another sentence. That is not how I remember it. Rowan sighed. How do you remember it? The boy's pencil moved across the page. You embarrassed her. The blunt honesty landed with uncomfortable precision. Rowan looked away. Because the child was right. He remembered the laughter now more clearly than ever. At the time it had seemed harmless. A passing joke. An insignificant moment. Yet the more he thought about it, the worse it felt. He had spoken carelessly because he assumed the person standing before him did not matter. That realization unsettled him more than any political mistake ever had. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued her work as if nothing had changed. She never mentioned the council meeting, never mentioned the search, never mentioned the prince. In fact, she seemed determined to avoid attention altogether. The palace staff noticed the difference in how others treated her now. People greeted her more often. Some even sought her opinion. Yet Evelyn responded with the same quiet kindness she always had. She neither encouraged the attention nor resented it. One evening, the elderly palace attendant who had first recognized Oliver's trust stopped beside Evelyn in the greenhouse. The same greenhouse where everything had changed. You know, the woman said softly, trimming a rose stem. There are people who spend their entire lives trying to be noticed. Evelyn smiled faintly. And then there are people who make others feel seen. The older woman looked toward her knowingly. Those people are much rarer. Evelyn lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. Before she could answer, footsteps echoed along the stone pathway outside. Both women turned. A tall figure appeared beyond the greenhouse doors. Dressed simply, without advisors or guards surrounding him, Rowan Blackthorne stepped inside. The elderly attendant's eyes widened slightly. Then, with suspiciously perfect timing, she announced that she suddenly remembered another task elsewhere and disappeared, leaving Evelyn and Rowan alone among the flowers. For several seconds neither spoke. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling above them. Somewhere nearby, a songbird called from a cedar tree. Rowan stopped a few feet away. His expression carried none of the confidence he displayed in courtrooms or council chambers. Instead, he looked almost uncertain, and somehow that surprised Evelyn more than anything else. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The greenhouse seemed suspended outside of time, wrapped in golden afternoon light and the quiet rustle of leaves. Evelyn looked down at the small gardening shears in her hand, suddenly aware of how strange this situation was. Kings did not seek out palace attendants. They certainly did not come alone. Rowan took a slow breath. Throughout his life, difficult conversations had never intimidated him. He had negotiated treaties, settled disputes, and addressed thousands of people without hesitation. Yet standing here felt unexpectedly different. I owe you an apology, he said at last. Evelyn blinked. Of all the things she expected him to say, that was not one of them. Rowan held her gaze. At the gala, I treated you unfairly. The words sounded simple, but neither of them missed their significance. Powerful people rarely admitted mistakes. Powerful kings, even less so. Evelyn remained quiet. Rowan continued. At the time, I convinced myself it was harmless. A joke. A passing moment. His expression tightened slightly. But I have thought about it more than I should have. A faint smile touched Evelyn's lips. That sounds exhausting. To his surprise, Rowan laughed softly. The sound felt unfamiliar even to him. It was. Silence returned, though this time it felt lighter. You helped Oliver when nobody else realized he needed help, Rowan said. You listened when everyone else was speaking. You noticed things the rest of us missed. Evelyn looked away toward a row of white roses. I only treated him the way I wanted someone to treat me. The honesty of the answer settled gently between them. Rowan found himself thinking about those words long after she spoke them. Because they explained everything. Not kindness for recognition. Not kindness for reward. Simply kindness because nobody deserved to feel invisible. That is rarer than you think, he said quietly. Evelyn shrugged. Maybe. A warm breeze drifted through the open greenhouse doors. Somewhere outside, birds sang from the palace gardens. For the first time since entering, Rowan felt no pressure to perform, no expectation to meet. He was not speaking to an advisor or noble. He was speaking to someone who saw people before titles. The realization carried an uncomfortable truth. He had spent years surrounding himself with ambitious voices. Yet some of the most important lessons had come from the one person he almost ignored entirely. Eventually, Evelyn glanced toward him. May I ask you something? Rowan nodded. Why did you come? Hear yourself? The question lingered in the air. Rowan considered several answers. Duty, gratitude, curiosity. None felt complete. Because I realized something, he said. I spent years believing leadership meant being heard. His eyes met hers. Oliver reminded me that sometimes leadership begins with listening. Evelyn stared at him for a moment. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile of a servant addressing a king. A genuine smile. The kind that reached her eyes. For reasons Rowan could not fully explain, that simple smile felt more valuable than the approval of every noble in the kingdom. Neither of them noticed the figure standing just beyond the greenhouse entrance. Oliver watched quietly from the pathway outside, a notebook tucked beneath one arm. A knowing smile spread across his face before he turned and walked away. Because for the first time in a very long while, he was no longer worried about either of them. Summer gradually settled over Blackthorne Palace. The crisis surrounding Oliver's disappearance became a story people stopped telling, replaced by newer concerns and newer conversations. Yet some stories did not truly end. They simply changed shape. On a quiet evening several weeks later, the palace gardens glowed beneath strings of lanterns hung between ancient cedar trees. Staff and nobles gathered together for a seasonal celebration far smaller than the Grand Gala that had started everything. The atmosphere felt different now. Softer. More human. Evelyn walked along a stone pathway carrying a basket of fresh flowers toward the greenhouse. She preferred the quieter corners of the palace. Some habits never changed. As she approached the garden entrance, she noticed familiar laughter nearby. Oliver sat beneath a flowering arbor with a notebook resting on his knees. Across from him sat Rowan. Neither wore formal expressions. Neither appeared burdened by titles or responsibilities. They simply looked like family enjoying a peaceful evening. Oliver spotted Evelyn first. His face brightened immediately. He raised a hand in greeting. Evelyn smiled and walked over. Rowan stood as she approached. Months ago, such a gesture would have shocked every noble in the kingdom. Now it felt natural. You are late, Rowan said. Evelyn laughed softly. I was working. That excuse is becoming less convincing every time. Oliver quickly wrote something in his notebook and turned it around. She always works. Evelyn pointed toward the accusation. See? Even he agrees. The three of them shared a quiet laugh. For a moment, nobody spoke. The garden lights flickered gently around them. Music drifted from somewhere deeper within the palace grounds. It was the kind of peaceful moment people rarely recognize while living it. Then Oliver wrote something else. This time he handed the notebook directly to Rowan. Rowan read the message and froze. A slow smile appeared. I suppose that is a fair question. Curious, Evelyn tilted her head. What is it? Rowan passed her the notebook. Her eyes moved across the page. What would have happened if nobody had spilled a drink at the gala? For several seconds, silence lingered between them. Then Evelyn laughed first. Rowan followed. Even Oliver smiled. The answer was obvious. None of this would have happened. No conversations beside a fountain. No search through the palace. No lessons learned. No friendships formed. One careless moment had changed everything. Eventually, the laughter faded. Rowan looked toward Evelyn. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "I am grateful it happened." The sincerity in his voice carried none of the distance that once separated them. Evelyn held his gaze. Then she smiled. "So am I." Nearby, lantern light reflected across the greenhouse glass. The same greenhouse where a missing prince had been found. The same greenhouse where apologies had been offered and understood. The same greenhouse where people finally began seeing one another clearly. And as the evening settled peacefully around them, nobody seemed concerned with titles anymore. Not king, not prince, not servant. Because the most important thing any of them had learned was surprisingly simple. The people easiest to overlook are often the ones who change your life forever.